In this video, we'll be talking about the very powerful render layers in Maya. This workflow allows you to render objects in different passes for later control in compositing using Nuke or After Effects or other such compositors. We'll want to start out with Still Life VO2 in the lighting projects under the Scenes folder. Make sure to set your project to the lighting project before you begin. We've got the scene open up here, and we'll take a look at the lighting that we've got. Is pretty simple. What we're going to try to accomplish is to get parts of the fruits and vegetables in the still life to render separately from one another. A full render of the scene is shown here. If we go into the layer editor right below the channel box and switch over to the render tab, you'll have access to the render layers. All scenes have a master layer turned on by default. Creating a layer for your scene is quite simple. All you need to do is figure out which objects you want to render separately and assign them to their own layers. Go ahead and turn off the wireframe shading to make the view a little easier in our perspective window. And let's set out to create a new render layer for the apple. Select the object and click this icon to create a new layer and automatically assign the apple to it. By default, this is called Layer 1. Simply double click and rename the layer appropriately. The more descriptive you are with your layer names, the easier it will be to navigate once you've rendered your scene. When we click between the master layer and the apple layer, we can see the objects disappearing in our scene. If we go into the apple layer and press 7, you'll see that it's completely dark. The master layer, if we press 7, you'll see that there's lighting in the scene. What you need to do is to add the lights in with the apple. To add objects, including lights, to an existing layer, simply select the objects in your scene or by using the outliner. Here it'll be a little bit easier if we select all the lights in the outliner and switch to the apple layer, right-click on the layer, and click on Add Selected Objects. As you can see, the lighting for the apple has come right into the scene. To add anything else, simply select it, right-click, and add. Once you created the apple layer, you may notice that the icon here on the left for the master layer had turned into a red X. This means that this layer is disabled for rendering, which happens by default when you create a new layer. That's not exactly what we want, so go ahead and click on that icon and it will re-enable that layer for rendering. Let's further segregate some of the objects in our scene into their own layers. Let's go ahead and do the background by selecting the pedestal and the cyc background, along with our lights, like this, and creating a new layer. We can call this layer BG for background, and now we have separated the background from the front foreground objects. Since we already have the apple separate, let's go ahead and separate out all the other fruit objects. We'll deselect the background objects. We'll deselect the apple. Control click will deselect, and then we'll control click to add the spotlights. We'll create a new layer and add those objects. And we'll create a new name called Fruit Layer for these objects. Now we have a fully segregated scene, allowing you to separate the background from the apple itself and from the fruits. Let's go back into our camera view. And when we render a frame of this, you'll notice that you'll only get the fruit objects. But the lighting on them is still exactly the same. We've lost the apple and the background. In the alpha channel, you'll be able to use this to composite the fruit back onto itself. Now we're going to open a pre-set up scene called Still Life Render Layers, again in the Lighting Projects scene folder. And in this scene we have several layers already set up with the fruit and the pedestal and the background in separate layers. The master layer is disabled because we'll be rendering everything in the scene in 4 separate layers. As you click on the different layers, you'll be able to render a render view of each of these layers individually. Let's go ahead on the foreground fruit, and we go ahead and render that out. And this is what we'll see. I've gone ahead and saved the renders for other layers, and you can see how separating them will give you options later to recreate the final frame. When you want to output your whole sequence through a batch render, Maya will automatically place the image files into folders named for your layers. Let's go ahead and set up the render settings to output just a few frames of an animation on this scene. We'll go ahead and set up name.number.extension with a frame padding of 4, and we'll set our end frame to 20. We have a 20 frame camera move on this scene, which you can see right here. We'll go ahead and export to a file format that supports an alpha channel. I prefer a TIFF that we can use. We'll make sure everything is set right, and we'll take notice of where the renders will go. My project is set properly, so it'll go in the images folder for that project. I'll next go down to make sure that this is the camera 1, that will be rendering. And right now it's set to perspective. Let's switch that to camera 1. And we'll check our resolution. Everything's good. And we'll check our quality settings are all good. When this is all set up and ready to go, I'll be able to render this out into a sequence of files. I'll switch to the rendering menu set, and I'll go ahead and go to batch render to render my scene. So you can see in the script editor, there's a number of frames being written out. When this is complete, we'll take a look at the files. Now that the render has completed, we can open up our Windows Explorer, or if you're using a Mac, you'd open up the Finder and navigate to your project's images folder. And here we can see Maya has rendered out into 4 separate folders named according to our render layers: background, background fruit, foreground fruit, and midground fruit. A quick look into the background, you can see that these have rendered out quite nicely, and the layers that have alpha channels will be able to composite easily. In this video, we learned how to create render layers to enable us to place different objects in the scene in different passes that are rendered separately from each other.